This is the Building Automation Monthly Podcast with Phil Zito, episode 173. Hey folks, Phil Zito here, and welcome to the Building Automation Monthly Podcast. In this episode, we are going to be trying something completely different. I am screen sharing right now. If you're listening to this on audio, you're like, okay, that doesn't help me very much. But the good news is that you will have a link to watch the video as well. Now, why a video for this podcast? Well, for a couple reasons. One, we're going to be doing a deep dive into how web graphical user interfaces work. So we're going to be talking about that in a great amount of detail. And the thing is I've realized, having talked about user interfaces with a lot of folks, they still don't seem to understand how all this stuff comes together. And I thought, man, one of the best ways to do this is to just kind of show how all these parts and pieces come together. So this is going to be pretty unscripted, pretty raw. So we'll see how it goes. Maybe we'll do this again if it goes well. Maybe we will never do this again if it goes bad. But anyways, so this episode is brought to us by our Information Technology for Building Automation Professionals course. So if you are looking for a course so that you can understand all of these IT concepts, networking, databases, servers, APIs, web user interfaces, all of those aspects of IT, then this is the course for you. I encourage you to check it out. You can find out some more information at buildingautomationmonthly.com/173. It's one of our most popular courses. It is essentially a college level education on all things IT, but communicated from a building automation perspective. So you're not spending time learning about things that really don't apply to the building automation world, but just kind of have to be taught because the college or wherever you're going is following a book that is loosely based on BAS, but not really. So this course will go and teach you everything you need to know about IT. And like all of our courses, it's fully online, comes with a lifetime access to the course, and live office hours every other Friday for you to come in and ask any questions you've got. All right, so you're looking at my screen right here, and you're seeing a couple things, right? So what's going on is I am running a web server. This is a web server right here. There's a couple different kinds of web servers you've heard. You may have heard of these: Apache, Node, IIS, which is the Windows web server. And since I'm running a Windows machine, I am running the Windows web server. Now, for those of you who want to kind of emulate this, it's quite simple. You just go to Start, type in Programs, Add or Remove Programs, at least in Windows 10. Go to Programs and Features right here. Let me drag this over. You're going to click Turn Windows Features On, which will be, it'll be right here. You'll click Turn Windows Features On. Okay. When you do that, you scroll down to IIS and you just simply check this box right here, and it'll give you everything you need. Once you've done that, then you have this default website, and you got to do a little bit more. So what you do then is you'll click Explore. And I know some of you who are listening to this podcast right now, you're like, what the heck, Phil? This isn't helping me. Just, if you're listening, skip forward a couple minutes, like 1.5 minutes, because it'll all be audio based, kind of, sort of, after that. I'm just telling folks how to get into what I'm doing right here. But you're going to go into this folder for IIS. You're going to create an HTML file. More on that in just a second. And in order to do that, you're going to have to go under the permissions for the folder, under properties, under security, and give yourself full access. Once you've done that, you can add an HTML file, which you can do simply by using I like to use Notepad+. You can see that right here. And then you could just do some HTML. All right. So, with all of that fun goodness being said, web user interfaces, why should we care about them? Well, back in the day, we had a thick client architecture, which meant you would have this sort of application, and the application would run on your desktop, and it would typically directly connect to your supervisory devices. However, nowadays, we are running this client-server architecture. So we have a web server like the one on my screen right here, and that web server serves up web pages like the one right here. And that web page allows us to pull data from our building automation system and present it in a nice, friendly HTML, which stands for Hypertext Markup Language. Now, what does all that mean? Well, Hypertext Markup Language is a fancy way of saying we're going to take some text and we're going to mark it up so that it actually has some structure to it. So if I go and I explore my folder here and I open up this index file, you'll notice a couple things, right? You'll notice that hypertext markup language files are structured in such that they have a head, right? Head, which is a field where things like your title go. So for example, we see your title here, right? But if I change this and I type in test 1, 2, 3, 4 and I save it, and then I refresh this, you're going to notice the head has changed up here. So the head enables you to have the name of the web page you're on. Now going a little bit more into these things. So HTML is providing all this structure, and within this structure, it has a body. Okay. And this is important for you all to understand because body is what structures everything on the web page. So then inside this body are all sorts of things. You can have headers, you can have paragraphs, you can bold things, you can italicize things. I'm not going to get into HTML itself, but the thing is that this web page gives us some structure. This HTML file gives us some structure. HTML file gives us some structure. From there, right? From there, this HTML file, right? From there, we have two other files called CSS, or cascading style sheets, and we have JavaScript, which is a scripting language which allows us to run actions. So for example, if I were to go to Google right here, we would notice that Google has a web page. And if I hit F12 and I go into developer mode, and I go under elements, I can see all sorts of stuff. And you can use this on almost any web page you're on. You can go into developer mode and you can see, we have things like style. And so style is a CSS sheet. And this CSS sheet gives us style, and style then sets our background colors, it sets our border types, etc. So if you're ever trying to change a static HTML page, maybe your BAS has an HTML page and you want to change it, you can change that in the CSS files. And then there's some buttons on this web page, and those buttons are all scripts. And so there's JavaScript that will run functions based on, so like we have on click functions, which on a click of a button, it causes some sort of action. And so that will allow us to go and send data, like if we want to update a zone temperature point, we can enter that data and then click a button, and that JavaScript will go and will take that and it will call a server function. So we would have our BAS software running on the server, and it would call a server function that would then go and it would make this BAS accept that zone temperature change. Now, how all of this happens is because of layers 4 through 7 of the OSI model. So layer 4, or the transport layer where TCP IP exists, is where we start, right? So TCP IP is going to allow us to create a session with another website. Once we create that session, then we move into the session layer, which is layer 5. And that session allows us to communicate data. So if I were to go into Wireshark, if I open Wireshark, so if I were to go into Wireshark and I were to just start sampling data from one of my network feeds. So if I were to find an interface, so like ISP Ethernet, and just start capturing stuff, I would start to eventually see that I have sessions in TCP, which TCP is going to be transmission control protocol, right? TCP is transmission control protocol, if I remember correctly. Why memorize what you can Google? TCP, transmission control protocol. I'm absolutely right. All right, so what happens is TCP creates these sequence acknowledge, and it's called the TCP handshake. And it basically makes sure that no data gets lost as you're communicating from the server to the actual web user interface. Then all of this stuff needs to be presented. And so the presentation layer formats everything. So it allows us to have formatting. And then finally, the application is where we have HTTP, or Hypertext Transport Protocol, which is going to allow us to have our HTML files come across and communicate in such a way so that now we have this user interface. And all of that comes together to form this HTML page. And the HTML page then allows us to pull data. Now, as I mentioned, we have CSS files, and CSS files are the skin. So oftentimes, when you want to go and customize a web user interface, and maybe you want to make a customer like has a weird request. They're like, I want all my pages to have a background of black or gray or orange or whatever. Well, you can do that through CSS. So CSS will allow you to go and make these color changes to the backgrounds of the pages, because you can have a style sheet. And what would happen is actually in the head, you would go and you would reference a style sheet. And you can kind of see that where we can start to go and reference things in our head. So we would go and we would include our style sheets. So in this case, in what I'm showing you on the screen for those of you who are listening, is I'm showing the Google search homepage in Google Chrome using F12, which gives me the gives me developer mode, and then I'm going to the Elements tab, and it's allowing me to show how I can reference all sorts of assets like a style sheet. In this case, they've got the style sheet actually embedded. But I can do that. I can reference any scripting languages I'm using, like JavaScript, etc. Okay, so back to what I was saying. So we've got our HTML, we've got our CSS now, and next comes JavaScript. And so JavaScript, or any scripting language like Angular, etc., is going to allow us to invoke functions. Now we have client-side functions and we have server-side functions. So client-side functions would be like when we push a button to submit a value to the server. Now the server is going to receive that value and it has to write it to the supervisory device. So that would be a function both on the client side and the server side. Now, certain client-side functions will be validated at the web server or at the web page, which they should be. They should be validated on the client. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if I go and I have an input to change zone temp, right? I shouldn't be able to put in ABC as the zone temp value. That should be caught on the client side. So that's called client side validation. Now you have server side validation as well. And you want to have that definitely because that will ensure that you catch other things as well, making sure that if anything happens to slip through the web validation, you'll catch it on the server side. Now, some of you are like, holy crap, Phil, this is overwhelming. All I wanted to learn about was graphical user interfaces. I just kind of wanted to understand graphical user interfaces. Why are you teaching me all this stuff? Why do I need to know this? Great. Excuse me. Let me take a swig of water real quick. Woo. Great question. Why do you need to know all this? I mean, really, at the end of the day, a lot of you on your building automation systems are just going to enable the web user interface and call it a day and the web pages. But here's the thing. As you start to get into more complicated scenarios, as you start to deal with more, customers who want more complex things, you may have to modify this stuff. Or more likely you're going to have either an outsourced developer or an in-source developer, someone who works inside your company, and you're going to have to communicate to them what you want. If you understand how all this stuff works, then it is that much easier. I've worked many a times back in my previous role working with developers that were offshore, having them create things, and understanding these concepts enabled me to communicate to them what I wanted the solution to do. Additionally, as you start to communicate or consume APIs, application programming interfaces, which we've done an episode on, as you start to consume APIs, you can do that actually on the client side, and you can actually go and script that on the client side or on the server side. So that's another little neat thing you can do. So let's say all of your customers wanted outdoor air to show up on the user interface up here, and they wanted it in the right-hand corner. Well, you could actually go and script that. You could script that consumption from maybe Open Weather Data API and have that auto-populate in the upper right-hand corner. Or maybe they had another system, perhaps, that they want to have that link, and maybe that's an HTML page. Maybe they have an access control system or a lighting system, and it's a web browser, and they want a link to that. Well, you can go and modify the HTML to add a link to that. So there's so many ways that this can benefit you. So in a nutshell, let's kind of wrap this up here. This will be a shorter episode, but it'll still be a good one. So let's wrap this up, how it all comes together. Well, what happens is that you log on to your BAS. You're sending a web request. So you are asking your BAS web server to send you an HTML page. That BAS server sends you the HTML page in a web response. Your BAS system opens up this web response and renders the page based on the CSS and the HTML and any functionality based on JavaScript. Then you are able to go and invoke any of those functions simply by interacting with the page, and then all of that interacts back with the BAS server and enables you to go and change values on a supervisory device and a field controller, etc. So that's how all of this comes together. I really encourage you, if you are trying to grow more in your career, to mess around with this. There's all sorts of examples of web pages and things you can do. And I encourage you to try these out and see how all of this comes together. It'll make you a better BAS tech, and it will make you better able to communicate with IT when you're trying to set up servers or web servers, when you're trying to troubleshoot things. I mean, you can go pretty deep down the rabbit hole. You know, you can go, if you want, and actually get to the point where you look up HTTP response codes, and you can actually start to understand response codes and what they mean, and what do all these values in the headers files mean. And there's all sorts of information. It's really cool, because I've met so many folks who they don't understand, like, what is a 300 redirection, and what's the difference between a 301 and a 307? What's the difference between a 400 and a 403? What is a 500? What does that mean? What is a 200? So understanding these HTTP status codes will really help you troubleshoot what is going on with your web server. It's pretty powerful stuff. So with that being said, thanks so much for listening to this episode. I know it was a little different. I know that for some of you, probably a little uncomfortable. Hopefully this isn't your first time listening to our podcast. We don't normally do video and audio, but I thought this was a good use of that medium. So with that being said, thanks a ton for being here. Look forward to talking to you. If you have any questions, this video will be on YouTube, so you can ask them there, and I'd love to answer them for you. And with that being said, I will see you all in next week's episode, which I believe will be on the topic of how to troubleshoot a building automation system. So if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, Facebook, or via our chat on our website. And go to buildingautomationmonthly.com/1 73 for any of the links that I've shown in this episode. Thanks a ton. Take care.